doing a little bit of research about you, I saw your name popping up with lots of really cool research and studies. And one of them was regarding some research you'd done around cocaine. Now, my listeners often send in questions, and we have had a few questions around cocaine use and its safety and, whether it is problematic or whether it's addictive or, people should be concerned about it. So I just thought while I had you on, I would pick your brain and let me know what your thoughts are and what your findings have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating question, and it's in the media a lot. When it comes to cocaine in Australia, it's one of our favourite drugs. Cocaine is predominantly produced and supplied by the South Americas. That's one of the reasons why it's very expensive here, because it predominantly goes to the US domestic market as opposed to coming here. But there are kind of two main groups of cocaine users, one being the classic kind of young professional male. And then at the other end, people who are polysubstance users who are at higher risk of mental disorders, homelessness, low employment, etc. So a lot of the media we get is around that first group. So the young finance and marketing bros that go out to clubs, and it's very much recreational, around footy season, etc., that occasional use. These are people who predominantly don't use any other drugs. They might drink on occasion, they might smoke on occasion, but they otherwise aren't injecting drugs or, using things regularly, such as heroin. So they're infrequent users. It does mean that some of the harms that we see around cocaine can be very, very acute, very short term. So we see things like increased risk of heart attacks and death from sudden medical events related to heart attacks. So cocaine is a stimulant drug. It works very quickly in the brain and in the body. And if you are a naive user and you have a very high dose, you are at risk of having myocardial infarction and other sudden medical episodes where you can die.
I've seen that firsthand. When I worked in emergency medicine, I had two young men who both had myocardial infarctions, cocaine related.
Yeah, so that's one of the main risks that we see. We also see risks around just silly behaviors, accidents that occur when people are using cocaine, and infections as well. For certain subgroups of the population, certain drugs like cocaine and also MDMA are associated with increased risky sexual behaviors. So for men who have sex with men, lack of condom use can occur, and we see that a lot with certain what we call party drugs. But with cocaine, it's really around that acute cardiac arrest type effect that is something that is really concerning, because it can happen among otherwise very healthy young people and among people who might not be seen to be at risk of drug use because they've not used other things. They're using it at a party. It's a one-off thing, but it doesn't mean you're immune to harms from that drug.
And I definitely have had some people who started off in that group, but who have become much more persistent users. And I've even had a patient recently with a horrendous nasal infection, just recurrent, really awful nasal infection. So they just can't get rid of it from snorting cocaine.
Absolutely. So it degrades the very, very delicate nasal tissue. And that's where you start to see things like a chronic runny nose, and then inability to fight off infections that would, when you develop a cold, it typically starts in your nasal passageway, which is why you get the COVID jab right up your nose. So this is where the germs are starting to multiply. And and cocaine administration through the nose can kill off a lot of these cilia, a lot of these little kind of protective hairs and other molecules and parts of the skin that protect from that. So you can see increased infection because of the fact that cocaine basically eats it away. Yeah, it's not pleasant.
And is it very addictive? Is it like addictive, like nicotine's addictive?
It is very addictive. It's I suppose it's kind of hard to compare drug to drug. Nicotine is probably the most addictive substance. Cocaine is very addictive because it is so intensely pleasurable for that period of time. We see cocaine dependency, definitely. So people who become dependent on cocaine over time. It is less common. than nicotine addiction and less common than heroin addiction. I think maybe because the young people who use it have fewer of those other risk factors that might lead them to being ongoing drug users. They've got stable occupations, they're highly educated, they've got, they're physically fit, and they've got good coping mechanisms. So I suppose they're somewhat protected in that way. But it is absolutely addictive. Any drug that enters your brain that gives you that intense dopamine response is going to make you want to do it again. So yeah, people can get addicted, especially if they don't have those other kind of like safety net behaviors. Like if they fall out of work, or if they do have a mental illness, or if they're in a peer group that is using drugs a lot, then we can start to see addiction and dependency develop.
And do you know, is there an increased risk of suicidality or violence whenever people take cocaine?
Yeah, with most drugs, cocaine included, we see an increased risk of suicidality and violence, yes, as well. So these stimulant drugs can give you this burst of confidence. And young men probably don't really need much more of a burst of confidence, and they do have very high levels of testosterone. And if they're very young, then they haven't developed that prefrontal cortex to kind of attenuate their behaviors. So yeah, we can see the cocaine, in addition to alcohol, increasing violence and aggressive behaviors. And for people who may be struggling, cocaine in and of itself is not going to increase your risk of suicide necessarily. But if you have other things going on in your life, and then you use cocaine, and you get this kind of like this feeling of potentially invincibility, that you can do no wrong, you might be more likely to take a risk that could then lead to accidental or unintended suicide. So things like driving too quickly or jumping off something that people might engage in when their brain is in that highly stimulated and low kind of control type response.
And are party drugs in Australia on the up or on the down, given that we know that young people are quite into their wellness?
Look, it seems that young people have stopped drinking and started using drugs. That would be my kind of like takeaway comment. Illicit drug use, party drugs, particularly ecstasy, are definitely on the up. There's still small numbers, but the trend over time is an increase, definitely. So it's something to be aware of. Party drugs on the whole tend to be less addictive because they occur in kind of like isolated periods of time. But it's often kind of like a foot in the door for other potentially risky behaviors. And we call this a gateway effect. So that can happen. So making sure that young people have that kind of like safety net of other positive protective factors around them, supportive family, engagement with friends, good lines of communication. These are all really important to keep young people safe so they don't start going down the risky avenue.
When I started this podcast back in December 23, I knew that I was lucky enough to have amazing conversations with various health professionals across all facets of medicine and allied health. And I knew that you would probably really enjoy being a fly on the wall to hear what we talked about. And that's how the podcast was born. And what you probably don't know is that this is a bit of a passion project. We don't have any sponsors or funding. And without your help, we won't be able to continue bringing you these great guests. So if you can please spread the word about the podcast, share it with someone who you think might benefit from the conversation that you've just listened to. Or if you can leave us a review or a comment, it would mean the absolute world, because that actually helps the podcast spread further and get more people to hear our message and hopefully allow us to invite bigger and bigger guests onto the show. And I would so appreciate you helping me back. Thank you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.